The text popped up just as I set my cracked coffee cup on the counter, steam from a brisket still hanging in the air. Dad, don't come tonight. Dean doesn't want you there. I'm Gideon Ray. 58, former auditor turned pitmaster. And that little cup's the last thing my late wife gave me. Ever been blindsided by family on a cold night? The message lit up my phone just as I set my old ceramic cup on the worn counter. Dad, don't come tonight. Dean doesn't want you there. The words hovered on the screen sharp as the November air sneaking through the gaps in my back door. I didn't move, not at first. The coffee had gone cold, but I lifted the cup anyway, fingers brushing the thin crack that spidered from its rim to its base. Lydia gave me this cup the last Christmas. We shared her laugh, echoing in my head as clearly as if she were still standing beside me, teasing me for my devotion to diner-grade mugs. Now it trembled in my hand, though I told myself it was the arthritis, not the text, making it shake. The smoke from the morning's brisket still clung to the rafters, weaving with the bitter scent of the coffee. East Nashville felt heavy this time of year, the Cumberland River a dull sheet of steel under the fog that never seemed to lift. I leaned my hip against the counter, staring through the window at nothing in particular, just to buy myself a moment before my thoughts caught up with me. Arden was 34 now, old enough to speak her mind, but I could hear the tightness behind those words. She was trying to soften the blow for me, even while relaying Dean's little decree. Dean. The man carried himself like he was the backbone of the neighborhood, chairing the HOA, organizing block parties, smiling for every photo. But I'd seen the overdue notices peeking from his mail stack once when I helped Arden move a dresser. He was stretched thin and desperate to look untouchable, a combination I'd seen 100 times back when I was combing through corporate ledgers. Men like that didn't like questions, especially from former auditors turned small-town pitmasters who knew how to read more than just numbers. The unopened HOA envelope lay on the counter, its edges curling from yesterday's drizzle. It had been sitting there since morning, glaring up at me every time I reached for my coffee or checked my brisket timer. I knew what it probably was, some new scheme to squeeze a little more from folks already juggling bills, but I hadn't been in the mood to confirm it. Tonight apparently wasn't going to involve sitting across from my daughter pretending everything was fine over overcooked turkey. Tonight it was just me, the smoke, and a mug Lydia once said made me look like a truck stop poet, whatever that meant. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the last streaks of pale light. My joints ached from the day's prep, but I stayed rooted to the counter, watching the river glint faintly in the distance. I wanted to text Arden back, tell her I understood. Maybe even tell her I was relieved to skip the polite dinner where Dean would find some reason to brag about his HOA projects, while side-eyeing me for wearing boots to his polished kitchen. Instead, I just stared at the phone screen until it dimmed my thumb, hovering but never typing. The cup's glaze caught a shard of sunlight sneaking through the blinds, a fragile, fleeting glimmer on its cracked surface. I tightened my grip, steadying it against the counter. The air felt colder, like the fog had crept inside with me. Somewhere in the rafters, a draft whispered through, making the envelope on the counter shift and rustle. That faint sound felt louder than the text ever could. The envelope had barely cooled on the counter before I unfolded the pages again, this time at my kitchen table above the restaurant. The letter was printed on heavy cream paper, as if the weight of the stock could soften the blow. Community beautification fee, $12,000. Payable in 60 days. The number floated in my head like a siren, impossible to ignore. At the bottom, in bold font that nearly swallowed the signature itself, was Dean's title, Chairman Eastview HOA. His pen stroke curled smugly, a flourish more suited for a CEO's Christmas card than a neighborhood levy. It didn't feel like business, it felt like a dare. Steam from the chili I'd left simmering on the stove clouded the window beside me, the moisture beating and running in rivulets as sleet tapped the glass from outside. Nashville winters weren't supposed to feel this cold, but maybe it was just me noticing every draft tonight. I lined up my bills on the table one after another, the yellow legal pad waiting like a silent judge. Property taxes. The repair estimates for the smoker Outback rust had crept in, where the paint bubbled. And now this $12,000 to beautify a community where most folks already spent their weekends scraping by. The phone rang, vibrating against the wood, its hum louder than it should have been. Arden's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered, "Dad." Her voice was tight, like she'd been rehearsing this for an hour. "I know you got the letter. He's just trying to make the neighborhood better. There's a new landscaping plan. Some signage." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I drew a neat line down the legal pad and started scribbling numbers, the pen scratching like a metronome against her words. "He says everyone's contributing, even us." She continued, her tone defensive now. "It'll raise property values. Long term, it helps everyone." Steam fogged the window, further blurring the streetlights outside into dull halos. My eye caught the laptop screen beside me, still open to my email. The HOA update sat in bold, and curiosity got the better of me. I clicked, scrolling past jargon about community cohesion. I landed on an attached budget there. It was buried between vendor contracts, a line item for transportation stipend. I didn't have to dig hard. The digital receipt all but shouted 2020. Lexus GX, lease. Dean's Lexus, the same one I'd seen him polish in his driveway last month while pretending to wave at passers-by. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Arden's voice broke the silence. "Dad, can you just be reasonable? This isn't personal, Dean." The pen snapped in my hand, the sharp crack cutting her off. A thin line of blue ink bled onto my thumb. What did he say? My voice was lower than I expected, steady, but colder. A pause, then almost a whisper. He said, "If you can't afford it, maybe it's time you move. Find somewhere. Easier." For a moment, the sleet's rhythm was the only sound. My gaze drifted past the fogged window to the framed photo of Lydia perched on the sill, her smile frozen mid-laugh. The kitchen smelled of chili and smoke, but underneath it all was the faint metallic tang of ink on my fingers. I set the broken pen down and leaned back in my chair. Maybe I murmured, barely audible, "It's time I stopped being quiet." The words felt foreign, but they didn't leave a bitter taste. Outside, the sleet turned to a steady rain, tapping harder against the glass, as if urging me to move. I stared at Lydia's photo, the shadow of my cracked ceramic cup on the counter beside it, and wondered if this was how resolve began, not with shouting, but with the quiet snap of a pen. I finally reached for the envelope, sliding a finger beneath its damp flap. The paper tore with a reluctant hiss. Inside, bold black letters stared back at me, unbothered by the dim light or the smell of smoked meat. Special assessment pending. For a moment, I just stood there, the paper in one hand, Lydia's cup in the other, the fog pressing against the windows like a curious onlooker. I didn't know yet if the assessment or the dinner snub would sting more by morning. All I knew was both were coming due, and neither would wait for me to catch my breath. The Riverbend diner still smelled like fried eggs, and yesterday's bacon grease, a scent that clung to the vinyl booths, no matter how much bleach Darla sloshed around after hours. The neon sign outside hummed weakly, its flicker casting a pink wash over the fogged window where the river glinted sluggish and brown under the heat haze. I slid into the corner booth, my cracked ceramic cup balanced on the table like a totem. I couldn't quite let go of, even if I didn't plan to pour anything into it. "Still add numbers in your head, Gid." The voice rasped behind me, a familiar growl softened by age but not by disuse. Calhoun slid into the booth opposite, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug. 62, retired but restless, he still carried himself like every ledger in the state had to pass his inspection before he'd sign off on it. His jacket smelled faintly of cedar, like his old office used to, a detail that yanked me back 20 years without warning. Darla dropped 2 laminated menus onto the table with a smack. "You two still look like you're plotting corporate coups," she teased, pencil poised over her pad. "Fried eggs, rye toast, black coffee." "Or are you big spenders now, same as always?" Calhoun said without looking up. He reached across and tapped my ceramic cup with one knuckle. "Don't let this break before you fix the real cracks, Gid. You hang on to the wrong things too long, they shatter on their own." I rotated the cup slowly, watching the thin fracture in the glaze catch the neon light. "Feels like everything's cracking," I muttered, more to myself than to him. Calhoun leaned in, his voice low, a habit from years of conference rooms and confidential audits. "You want Dean handled, don't blow your top. Collect first, confront later. People like him bury themselves if you just give them enough rope and a reason to talk. The smell of fried eggs hit the table as Darla set down 2 plates, yolks glistening rye toast, already sweating butter. I barely touched mine. Calhoun pulled a napkin from the dispenser, and with the same neat penmanship I'd watched him use to close billion-dollar reconciliations, wrote 3 bullet points. Request financial disclosures. HOA bylaws mandate transparency. 2. Track expense line items, look for stipends, miscellaneous contracts. 3. Back up everything hard. Copies, not just the cloud. He slid the napkin across the table. Dean's arrogant. He's the type who leaves trails not because he's sloppy, but because he thinks no one will ever bother to follow them. Make sure you do. I nodded, the diner's hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the kitchen's flat-top grill. The cracked cup felt heavier than it should in my hand. I didn't pour coffee into it. I just kept it close, a reminder of Lydia's steadiness, of the promise I'd made at her bedside to keep our family anchored. After Calhoun left, I lingered long enough for Darla to refill my water and offer a conspiratorial wink. "Whatever you two are cooking up, just don't bring it down on my tips," she said, sliding the bill across the table. Back in my truck, I drafted the email Calhoun had suggested. Short, formal, and polite, with a simple request: the HOA's quarterly expense ledgers for the past 18 months, citing bylaw 4.3. I hit send, the faint click sounding louder than expected in the cab. Dean's automated reply hit my inbox within minutes. Out of office, attending leadership retreat, Scottsdale, AZ. I almost deleted it without a glance, but my eyes caught the thread of CC'd recipients beneath his smug signature. There, tucked between line items in the attachment, was a glaring omission, missing ledger entries, months blanked out where there should have been HOA operating expenses. Before I could dig deeper, my phone buzzed again. A text from Calhoun, print everything. Do not trust the cloud. I turned the cracked cup over in my passenger seat, tracing the fracture with my thumb, as the diner's neon glow faded in the rearview mirror. The yolk-yellow stain of the sunset bled into the river below, and I felt the first hint of something I hadn't in months. Not anger, but resolve, solid and slow building, like smoke catching in a pit before the fire takes. The Windmere Community Clubhouse never felt like it deserved the title. It was a long, echoing hall dressed up with folding chairs and laminate tables lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed like a dentist's drill. The scent of carpet cleaner hit first, sharp and chemical, as if someone had scrubbed away the evidence of previous grievances. I took my usual seat at the end of the table, the cracked ceramic cup in front of me filled with black coffee so bitter it left a metallic taste. My fingers curled around it, the glaze rough under my thumb, where Lydia's favorite cup had worn thin. Dean sat at the head like he owned the place, his posture easy, his voice honeyed when he welcomed everyone to the special hearing. Arden was at his right, her shoulders drawn tight, eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying in the parking lot. She mouthed something, sorry maybe, but I couldn't be sure. Dean shuffled a neat stack of papers and began. Due to recent evaluations and inflationary pressures, the projected assessments have been adjusted. Each homeowner will now owe $36,000 payable within 90 days, or a lien will be placed. His tone never wavered, but the pause afterward hung heavy, the fluorescent hum filling the void like static. I took a slow sip of coffee, the steam curling past my nose sharp enough to make my eyes sting. The ceramic trembled just enough to send a ripple across the surface, a tiny wave I couldn't steady. My other hand found the envelope Mrs. Sorrell had discreetly passed me last week. Copies of expense logs with suspicious gaps. Across from me, Mrs. Sorrell, the HOA treasurer, cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. Dean, these numbers. There's no board vote logged for page 4. Her eyes flicked toward me, apology and warning bundled into a glance. Dean's smile never faltered. The board was consulted in executive session, he said smoothly. The minutes were streamlined for efficiency. He leaned back, fingers drumming softly against the table. The sound, soft but steady, carried more threat than any raised voice. I reached for the post-it she'd slipped into the folder, a yellow square with 3 words scrawled in her delicate hand. Check page 4. The note felt weightier than the paper should allow. My fingers shook, arthritis, flaring nerves humming. The cup balanced precariously on the edge of my notes, tipped as I moved. The crack as it hit the tile floor silenced the room. Black coffee splattered across the meeting minutes, soaking into Dean's pristine papers, the smell sharp and bitter in the sterile air. The ceramic split in two, the handle rolling toward Dean's polished shoes, before he nudged it aside with the toe of his loafer. I crouched, knees popping to gather the shards. Each piece felt heavier than it should, slick with cooling coffee. Dean crouched too, his mouth close enough that I felt the warmth of his breath when he whispered, "Maybe it's time you retired for good, Gideon, before this gets uglier than it needs to be." Arden's chair scraped softly as she stood, her hand trembling when it landed on my shoulder. Her voice was a whisper. "Just for me, Dad." "What are you planning?" I didn't answer. The fluorescent buzz swelled in my ears, drowning out the murmurs around the table. The handle of Lydia's cup rested in my palm, the curve fitting perfectly against my fingers, as if reminding me that some things and some battles weren't meant to be surrendered just because someone else said so. The only sound in Mrs. Sorrell's kitchen was the low, erratic hum of the under-cabinet bulb. Its cone of light painted the laminate table in a pale yellow circle, leaving the rest of the room in heavy shadow. The snow outside fell in lazy, slanted lines, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. I sat hunched over a spread of spreadsheets and receipts, my hands stiff from the cold, the yellow legal pad beneath them filling with columns of numbers in my blocky handwriting. Beside the pad, the ceramic cup. Lydia's cup sat patched together with a thin strip of yellow tape that looked almost absurd against the faded glaze. The glue held but faint lines spiderwebbed beneath the tape, a quiet reminder of how close everything had come to shattering. I cradled it between calculations, the warmth of the black coffee inside soaking into my hands like a lifeline. Mrs. Sorrell, wrapped in a chunky cardigan that swallowed her small frame, flipped through another HOA ledger, her brow-furrowed glasses sliding to the tip of her nose. "Look here," she whispered, tapping a finger against a string of landscaping invoices. Each one lists a different company name, but they all route back to the same post office box. "That's Dean's brother-in-law's LLC. He's laundering the assessments into family pockets." The numbers were stark, but it was the patterns that mattered. Duplicate entries, odd timestamps, fees, rounded suspiciously clean. I hadn't been a corporate auditor for nearly a decade, but the instincts came back like muscle memory. I drew neat arrows connecting the entries, every joint in my hand, aching my breath, fogging faintly in the cold air that leaked through the old kitchen windows. Mrs. Sorrell leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "I found this too." She slid her phone toward me. The screen paused on a grainy security clip from the clubhouse. Dean in a dark coat slipping into the records room just after midnight, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He glances once toward the camera, a brief flicker of awareness, then disappears into the room. No sound, just the stuttering timestamp in the corner. 01:12 a.m. The glow from the phone made the taped cup glint, the yellow strip casting a faint shadow on the table. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the weight of evidence stacking in my mind. It wasn't just an inflated fee anymore. This was fraud, clear as the snow piling against the porch. The under-cabinet bulb buzzed louder, almost in sync with the faint vibration of my phone as a new email arrived. The sender's name glared at me, Dean Forster. "Cease your witch hunt," the email read, "or face legal action for harassment and defamation. You're on notice." The coffee inside the patched cup rippled as my grip tightened. The tape creaked softly, but it held. I set the cup down carefully, fingers lingering on its rim until the tremor in my hands eased. Across from me, Mrs. Sorrell whispered, "He's watching us, Gideon. He must know you're digging." I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain just enough to focus. "That's fine," I said, voice low but steady. "He doesn't know what I already have. And he doesn't know Calhoun's back in the game." As if on cue, my phone buzzed again, a text this time, from Calhoun Time, to set the trap. Friday, 7 p.m., board meeting, don't flinch. I looked down at Lydia's cup, the yellow tape a thin scar against the ceramic, and felt the faintest flicker of something close to resolve. Outside, the snow thickened, the flakes swirling like ash in the porch light. I gathered the ledgers into a neat stack, slid them into a battered briefcase, and met Mrs. Sorrel's worried gaze. "We're not done yet," I said quietly, standing. "Friday we bring this into the light." The buzzing bulb dimmed for a moment, then steadied its hum, filling the kitchen as the snow tapped harder against the glass. I tightened my scarf, pocketed Calhoun's message, and stepped into the night, the patched cup carefully cradled in my gloved hand. Every head turned as I pushed open the heavy glass door of the Winmere boardroom. The hinges squealed faintly, a sound that felt louder than it should in the stale air. Under one arm, a weathered briefcase stuffed with ledgers and printouts. In my other hand, Lydia's cup, patched and scarred, but upright warm with the last pour of black coffee from my thermos. I felt every pair of eyes track the slow click of my boots across the carpet, the smell of overbrewed coffee and carpet glue clinging to the room like a damp coat. Dean sat at the far end of the polished table chair, tilted slightly back, a thin sheen of sweat already visible along his hairline, despite the chill in the room. His smile twitched when his gaze dropped to the cup in my hand, as though the taped scar on its side unsettled him more than the briefcase. Arden, for the first time, wasn't beside him. She sat off to his left, posture, rigid fingers clutching a manila folder so tightly the edges had begun to fray. Her knuckles were nearly as white as her face. Calhoun leaned quietly against the back wall, hands in the pockets of his worn coat. A slight nod, the only acknowledgement, as I took my seat opposite Dean. His eyes, calm and steady, told me what I needed to hear. Collect first, confront later. Let the evidence talk. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Mr. Ray, you asked for this session to present." Something. I set the cup down gently on the table, the faint tap echoing in the hushed room. From my briefcase, I slid out a neat stack of printed emails, each one highlighted with precise strokes, and a flash drive no larger than my thumb. "I'll keep this simple," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected in the stale air. "These are late-night transfers authorized by Dean Forster, routed through a landscaping vendor owned by his brother-in-law." And here I clicked the USB into the laptop at the end of the table. The screen flickered to life, grainy footage filling it. Dean, under dim security lights, slipping into the records room after midnight with a duffel bag. The timestamp blinked in the corner, silent but damning. A murmur rippled through the board members' chairs, creaking as they leaned closer. Dean shifted forward, his composure cracking. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped, voice climbing. "Half those entries are clerical errors, and that video doesn't prove anything. You're dragging this community through the mud." Before I could reply, Arden rose. Her hands shook as she placed the manila folder in the center of the table. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "These," she said, "are the documents Dean made me sign. He told me it was just routine, just to streamline approvals. But these are forged board votes, and I can't do this anymore." Her breath hitched. She glanced at me, then back at the board. "I'm done covering for him." Dean's face flushed crimson. "Arden, think about what you're saying," he hissed, his voice laced with panic now. "Do you realize the legal enough?" one of the board members said sharply, cutting him off. A heavy silence followed, punctuated only by the faint hum of the ceiling vent and the muted gurgle of the ancient coffee maker in the corner. "Mr. Forster, these allegations combined with the evidence leave us no choice. Hand over your keys. Effective immediately, you're removed as chair." For a moment, Dean froze, jaw-tight, eyes darting to each face around the table. Then, with a sudden movement, he yanked the key fob from his pocket and hurled it onto the polished wood. It struck with a sharp metallic clack that echoed like a gavel, final and cold. Without another word, he stormed out the glass door, swinging hard enough to rattle the frame as it closed behind him. The silence afterward was heavier than before, the tension in the room, now a hollow void. Arden stood motionless, her hand lingering on the empty space where the folder had been. She turned to me, eyes glistening in the fluorescent light, her voice no more than a whisper. "What now, Dad? Can we fix any of this?" I glanced at the taped cup beside me, its faint yellow seam catching the overhead glare. The coffee inside had gone lukewarm. The steam long faded, but the cup still held. I wrapped my fingers around it, feeling the rough edge of the tape under my thumb, and drew in a long, measured breath. Outside, somewhere beyond the double-paned windows, A car engine faded into the night. In the boardroom, no one spoke, the only sound the slow drip of the coffee maker into its scorched pot. I looked at Arden, her shoulders trembling slightly, and felt the weight of every choice past, present, and the one still waiting. Brisket smoke lingered in the rafters, clinging to the exposed beams like a second coat of varnish. The dinner rush had thinned to a gentle hum of voices, the occasional clink of forks against enamel plates. Outside, cicadas buzzed their chorus, seeping through the screen door as twilight deepened over East Nashville. Arden and I moved in near silence, ragging down tables and sweeping crumbs into a dented dustpan. Our motions slow, deliberate, almost meditative. For weeks, the space between us had felt like the length of the Cumberland River. Tonight, it was closer, tentative, but closer. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at me as I stacked chairs. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said quietly, the words slipping out like a reluctant confession. "I should have told you sooner about the debts. I thought I could handle it. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit I couldn't." Her voice thin, trailing into the low thrum of the cicadas outside. I set the last chair upside down on the table, the legs crossing like the arms of a watch. "I know why you stayed quiet," I said, keeping my tone even. Dean had a way of making silence feel like the safest choice. But silence doesn't build anything. It just leaves rooms empty. Before she could respond, my phone buzzed on the counter. Calhoun's name lit the cracked screen. I swiped it up and held it between my shoulder and ear while I wiped down the register. His gravelly voice carried over the faint static. "Heard the board voted to freeze Dean's accounts," he said. "That's something. Now use it for more than your own back rent gid. Partner with someone. Make the money do something clean for once." I glanced at Arden, who'd paused mid-step, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Any suggestions?" I asked. Calhoun chuckled low and dry. "I'll connect you with a nonprofit in town. They do workshops for first-time homeowners, budgeting credit, all that dull but life-saving stuff. You've still got the audit chops. Let this mess turn into something useful, not just another battle scar." "Send me their number," I said, shifting the phone to my other ear. "We'll figure it out." Arden leaned against the counter, listening as I hung up. Her expression softened, the tension that had lived around her eyes finally easing. She reached for the stack of notes we'd drafted earlier, a tentative plan to repurpose the seized HOA funds into a community workshop series, and slid them toward me. "I want to help," she said, voice steadier now. "Not because I owe you, but because I don't want to keep running from every bad decision. And if it means spending more nights here helping out, learning again, if you'll have me." I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I turned to the small shelf above the register, the one that held Lydia's cup. The yellow tape still wrapped its seam, neat and unapologetic. I lifted it briefly, feeling its weight, then set it back down, gently angled, so it caught the last slant of daylight filtering through the blinds. "There's room here," I said finally, voice softer than I meant. "Always has been. Just needed someone to claim it." As Arden smiled faintly, the front door creaked. A courier stepped in, his sneakers squeaking against the wood floor. He held out a thin envelope, state seal, stamped in dark ink across the front. "Mr. Ray." "From the Attorney General's office," he said, handing it over with a practiced neutrality. The cicadas outside seemed to quiet for a moment, or maybe my ears just narrowed to the rustle of paper as I slid a finger under the flap. Arden's gaze met mine, question unspoken, but heavy in the space between us. I didn't open it yet. I just set it on the counter beside the register, beside the taped cup, and let the last of the daylight settle across both. The repaired cup felt cool against my palm, the yellow tape now dulled from months of rinsing, but still firm along the seam. Evening sun stretched long over Windmere Community Park, throwing soft shadows across the new benches and young oaks we'd planted with what was left of Dean's failed empire. Kids raced along the paved paths, chalk dust streaked up their arms, leaving crooked rainbows on the sidewalk. The scent of fresh-cut grass tangled with the slow curl of hickory smoke rising from my grill stand. A folding table served as a makeshift podium. I wasn't one for speeches, never had been, but the board insisted I say a few words at the meeting. I raised the cup slightly more, a nod to myself than the crowd. 2 years ago, I began my voice carrying just enough to hush the chatter this park was on a spreadsheet marked optional improvement. Now it's proof that even bad ledgers can be rewritten if we're stubborn enough. A ripple of chuckles passed through the neighbors. Arden stood off to my right, a serving tray balanced on her hip, handing out plates of ribs and cornbread. She caught my eye and smiled, a soft, unburdened curve that made her look younger than she had in years. Her laughter carried faintly as she teased a group of kids, smearing chalk on their sneakers. For the first time since Lydia's funeral, I felt no pinch in my chest. At the sound, just a gentle warmth, like an ember that doesn't burn, but glows steady. Calhoun ambled up after I wrapped the brief remarks, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Not bad for a guy who used to think charity meant letting someone borrow a calculator," he said, lips quirking. His other hand reached for a rib from the tray without asking, as always. "You turned a mess into something that might actually keep folks afloat." Lydia would have liked that. "I think she would have liked the ribs more," I muttered, drawing a low laugh from him. I lifted the cup and took a sip of sweet tea, the ice clinking gently. The crack, though sealed, caught the fading sunlight, like a thin vein of gold, a scar not to be hidden, but to be seen, proof of what held, instead of what broke. The park hummed with life, neighbors swapping stories over paper plates, kids drawing hopscotch grids and pastel loops, the faint buzz of cicadas rising as the sun dipped behind the trees. Arden stepped beside me, wiping barbecue sauce from her hands onto a napkin. "It feels different now," she said, voice soft, as if she didn't want to disturb the moment. "Lighter, like we're not just patching holes but building something new." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I set the cup on the picnic table, steady and sure, and watched as the last streaks of daylight slid across the park. The benches, the trees, the laughter, all of it humming with a kind of resilience I hadn't thought possible a year ago. My hand drifted to the rim of the cup, tracing the tape's edge, not with regret, but with a quiet sort of pride. The cicadas grew louder, their steady song blending with the distant laughter of children. Arden leaned her head lightly against my arm, just for a moment, before moving to refill a neighbor's plate. Calhoun nodded once from across the lawn, tipping a paper cup of sweet tea in my direction, before wandering off to join a cluster of board members. As the sun slid below the horizon, the park lights flickered on, bathing everything in a soft amber glow. I picked up the cup again, took one last slow sip, and let the cool tea linger on my tongue. The scar along its side gleamed once more in the fading light before the shadows took it. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was holding something fragile. I just felt steady. The park lights glowed soft as I set the repaired cup on a bench beside me, its taped seam catching a hint of moonlight, while cicadas hummed low in the trees. Watching neighbors linger over barbecue and laughter, I realized the crack in that cup never meant weakness, just proof it could hold more than I thought. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding, and sometimes it's the smallest mended things that remind us we're still standing. If you've ever faced loss or found a new start, how did you make peace with the scars? Share your story. I'd like to hear it.